This
certified.
conference will now be recorded.
So if you happen to be working in a larger organization that has some strict IT policies or stuff like that, I'm happy to announce that now we actually have this code certified. So it should be easier to have the tool whitelisted in your IT organization. Now, the reason that a lot of people really like Tabular Editor is that it's so lightning fast compared to the standard tool, so compared to desktop and Visual Studio, for those of you who have been working with that. And the reason it's so fast is that it's only working with model metadata. So it's not loading the actual model data inside the tables, only the model metadata. And then it just allows you to manipulate those metadata all around. And then the moment you hit the save button, it goes and synchronizes the database with the changes that you make to the model metadata. Unlike Visual Studio and Power BI Desktop, where every single time you make a small change to the model, like changing a format string or editing a DAX expression of a measure, it goes and synchronizes the database all the time in the background. And that's where you see this little spinner where it says working on it that you have to wait for. But that doesn't happen with Tabular Editor. The synchronization only happens when you hit the save button. So in the daily workflow, you'll see that it's much faster and much more fluent, and at least in my opinion is that it provides a much better developer experience for the BI developer. So I mentioned that today there's not really support for it in Power BI. You can still do, and some people still use it together with Power BI. Specifically, most people, what they do is they save their PBIX file as a PBIT, a Power BI template, because the PBIT file you can actually open already today in Tabular Editor and make some changes and then save it back. And if you're lucky, things will actually work when you open the PBIT file back in Power BI Desktop. But officially, it's unsupported to make changes to your Power BI model this way. So in case you break something, in case the file doesn't work suddenly, then Microsoft will not support you and you're sort of on your own. However, as of today, we actually do have support for editing Power BI dataset that have been published to the Power BI service. And the way we can do that is through the so-called XMLA read-write endpoint. Now, this endpoint is only available for those of you who are publishing your models to Power BI premium workspaces or dedicated capacity. And that last thing is actually one of the things I'm going to show you in the demo in a little bit. One thing to be aware of, though, is that if you enable the XMLA read-write endpoint, you should be aware that it's not possible to download the dataset as a PBIX file once you've made any changes to the file. So it sort of gets into this state where you can no longer download it as a PBIX. So it's just something to be aware about. This is a limitation currently. I expect that this is something that will change in the future. And speaking of the future, as I mentioned earlier, in a couple of months, we are going to get starting to get some support for directly editing your Power BI Desktop model through Tabular Editor. In the first round, we are going to get support for editing measures and calculation groups, metadata translations, and perspectives. And the interesting thing is that these last three items, cat groups, translations, and perspectives, those are things that are actually supported by the analysis services engine running underneath Power BI, but there's no way that you can actually create these objects using the Power BI Desktop authoring interface. So actually what this means is that Tabular Editor is actually going to unlock new functionality inside Power BI Desktop functionality, which is already there in analysis services, but which so far has been sort of not available to Power BI developers. So this is actually quite interesting, and this is also one of the things I'm going to show you later on. Another thing to note here is that in order for all of this to work, you have to use the new enhanced metadata format. That's a preview setting that you set up inside Power BI Desktop. I'm going to show you as well. And once again, you should be aware that there are some limitations to this. Specifically, if you're using certain kinds of Power Query data sources, then you may have issues with the data sources not being able to refresh after you upgrade to the enhanced metadata. So the bottom line is to always keep a backup of your PBIX file before you start to, especially if you start to experiment with some of the things I will show you here today, even before the official support is coming. But I would say that even after we get support, initially it'll probably only be preview support. So even then, the official recommendation would be to keep things not in a production setting, but to be careful to always have backups and so on. All right. So why would we use Tabular Editor? Well, I already mentioned that one of the primary reasons, which is the speed of the user interface, is just so much faster, and just at least once you get used to it, it's just a nicer development experience than having to switch back and forth between modeling view and data view and so on, and things you're used to in Power BI Desktop. There are a couple of other things here as well, and I'm going to go over some of these in the demo. But I'd like to point out that Marco Russo, the Italian DAX guru himself, has endorsed it and saying that at this point there's no doubt that Tabular Editor is the more productive editor for analysis services tabular models. And I'd like to extend this quote by saying that very soon this will then also apply to Power BI models. So I'll go through the demo and you'll be able to see for yourself, and then I encourage you to just give it a try and see how you like it. Before you do though, there's a slight catch. I normally warn people telling them that Tabular Editor is not really well suited if you are new to tabular modeling. So if you have no clue what the difference is between a calculated column and a measure and so on, then Tabular Editor is probably not for you. I would say that you should keep working with the tools that you're used to, Power BI Desktop or Visual Studio, until you really get a feel for tabular modeling and until you're really familiar with that. At some point, you will also start to get tired of working with these tools once you see the little working on it spinner sufficiently many times. And at that point, you're probably ready to switch over to Tabular Editor. And one of the reasons why Tabular Editor is not well suited for beginners is that there's no diagram view, there's no DAX intelligence. So when you're typing DAX code, you have to sort of know the formulas that you want to type beforehand. It doesn't let you work with the data or preview the data in the model or even evaluate the result of a calculation. And then, of course, being an open source tool, there's no 24/7 support. There's no hotline you can call if things stop to work. You can, of course, post an issue on GitHub, and someone will usually reply within a couple of hours. But that's sort of the situation with open source tools, I guess. And then the documentation is probably also lacking a little bit. So for the past 3 years, when I've been developing and working on Tabular Editor, I've prioritized building new features and fixing bugs over creating actual documentation. And this is also actually an encouragement to the community. So if anyone wants to contribute, especially on the documentation side, you are more than welcome. I'd be happy to add you as a contributor on the GitHub side. It doesn't really matter what your contribution is, whether it's just fixing up some of the documentation already there, or providing some scripts or anything that you feel can help other Tabular Editor users. Just let me know.
Daniel?
Yeah.
Can I shout out the questions from the chat box here?
Absolutely.
So limitation to download back, I'm guessing then from Power BI service is only for Pro or even for Premium/Embedded.
So I guess the question refers to the note I had here about not being able to download the PBIX once you edit the model through XMLA. And the thing is, for Power BI Pro users that are using the so-called shared capacity, you won't have the XMLA write endpoint available at all. So if you're on Pro and you don't and you haven't purchased dedicated capacity on the Power BI service, then you won't be able to edit the dataset in the service at all. So in order to use the XMLA write endpoint, you either need Power BI Premium or you need to purchase dedicated capacity. And I'll show you this last point in a little bit. And then the limitation applies as soon as you make a change to your dataset, then it'll get into a state where you can no longer download the dataset as a PBIX file. Okay, other questions, Ida?
That's it for now.
Okay, so I have a slide here that sums up some of the features of the tool, but instead of going over them line by line, I feel that we should just jump into the demo. So let's start by looking at Power BI Desktop, because here I have a very simple model based on the AdventureWorks relational database. You can see I imported a couple of tables, I created the relationships between them, and that's about it. So I didn't spend any time fine-tuning this model or creating explicit measures or anything like that. I only imported the tables and set up the relationships the way I wanted them. And at this point, of course, if I was a regular Power BI developer, I would go in and I would start to rename some items over here. I would probably hide back tables, create explicit measures, all of that stuff. But very, very soon there will be a better way of doing this. As you'll notice up here, we have this new external tools ribbon, and this is a new tab that I was talking about that I actually developed at Microsoft on the Power BI contributor program, which allows this integration with third-party tools. And I'd like to shout out also to Bism Normalizer, or I guess it's called ALM Toolkit these days, which was created by Christian Wade, who also works for Microsoft, which is this tool that lets you easily compare two models, tabular models, to see if there are any difference between them, and then apply the schema changes to one model or the other. And then, of course, there's DAX Studio, which most of you probably already know, which is this tool created by Darren Gospel together with Marco Russo for writing and analyzing DAX queries. And finally, we have Tabular Editor. So let's go ahead and click this guy. And as you can see, it spins up this little tool, Tabular Editor, and it's already connected to the instance of analysis services running underneath Power BI Desktop. So what we see here is a hierarchical representation of the data model. So we start at the model level, and then you can see we expand the tables. We get this hierarchy of all the tables in the model. And once we expand the tables, we can view the partitions that are on the table. Partitions are not something that you're used to working with in Power BI Desktop, but this being analysis services, then of course we have partitions there as well. You can see in this case, the partition holds the M expression that is being used to populate the table with data. And then you can see, of course, all the columns, and you can view the format string that's applied to the columns, what data type it is, and so on. There's a lot of information here. And so at this point, you're actually ready to start using the tool to make changes to your model. And the cool thing here, once this integration with the external tools is publicly released, then you will see that once you connect this way, every time you make a change in Tabular Editor and you click the little save button here, it's going to synchronize these changes back to the analysis services model, and then you should see the Power BI Desktop interface update immediately to reflect the changes that you made in Tabular Editor. If you try today with the version of Power BI Desktop that you already have today to connect Tabular Editor, you can actually do that by going up here saying File, Open from Database, and then from this drop down you can actually point it to the PBIX file that you are currently working with, and that works just fine. And you can do the same thing as here. You can view the model, but the problem is that today Power BI Desktop will not react to any changes that you make from Tabular Editor. So if you add a new measure or something like that, then that measure is not going to show up inside Desktop. Some people report that if they just click the refresh button, then they can make it show up, or if they save the file, close Desktop and reopen it, then it also shows up. But the thing to keep in mind here is that it's not really supported, so that's why it doesn't really work. But once we get this feature here publicly released, then you'll see that this stuff will be much smoother and it will be a much better developer experience, where you can switch back and forth between Power BI Desktop and Tabular Editor to your heart's content. So now that we're inside Tabular Editor, what options do we have? What can we actually do here? Well, the first thing that I like to highlight is how easy we can make batch changes to this model. So let's say, for example, that's one of the first things that I want to do is I want to hide all of these columns because they're just surrogate key columns on a fact table or numeric columns. And I don't remember if they have multi-select in Power BI Desktop. At least I don't think we have multi-select on the report or the data view. But in Tabular Editor, it's just a matter of multi-selecting all of these guys, right-clicking, choosing the make invisible, and you can see they turn gray immediately. There's no downtime, no waiting for a little spin or anything like that. Oh, and also if we make a mistake along the way, well, there's an undo functionality, and we can undo all the operations, the changes that we have made to this model. To make things a little more interesting, let me try to create a new measure here. So I'll create a new measure. We call it PBI Norway. And we just set its value to 1, 2, 3, doesn't really matter. And then we hit the save button. And then on our fact reseller sales, we should see that, hey, sure enough, now we have this little guy down here in our Power BI model, and we can use this. So let's bring it onto the canvas. Let's change it to a card visual. And now we can see that if we go back to Tabular Editor and we change the DAX expression to something else, so let's type 456 instead, then as soon as we hit save, you can see that it's updating in Power BI Desktop as well. So the cool thing here is that now I can do all the I can use all the operations that I'm used to making in Tabular Editor, and then once I'm ready to publish these changes to Power BI Desktop, I can hit the save button. So just one example is let me make a number of copies of this measure. So here I just made 7 copies simply just by hitting Control C and Control V. And let's put some of these guys into a display folder like this. And let's just hit save, see what happens. And you can see immediately the list displays the new measures here. We should also see the folder show up here somewhere. It's down here. And some of you may have noticed that apparently these guys have the same name over here in desktop, which looks like a bug because normally a measure cannot have the same name. But this is just in fact because when I copied the measure in Tabular Editor, Tabular Editor would also copy the translation of this measure. And this is a new feature that you're not used to when you're working with Power BI Desktop, but on a Power BI model, you actually have a translation, and you can have multiple translations as well, since it's just analysis services. And you can see once I switch to this Danish translation here, you can see now it looks like all of these measures have the same name, but this is just because they have this. They inherited the translation from the base measure that I copied. So in order to get rid of the translation, I can just go in here and set the translated name to a blank value. And then we see that now they sort of retain their original name, and they are no longer colored blue, which would indicate that there's a translation. So if I now click save once again, you can see that now, sure enough, we get unique values. We get the correct names to show up in the field list for all of these guys. But hopefully, just by some of the stuff I've shown you here, by being able to copy measures and paste, and even stuff like dragging and dropping between folders, adding subfolders, you can probably already appreciate how much productivity you can gain by using this tool, as you don't have to wait between every single operation that you apply to the model. And this is just being able to do this kind of stuff is just the tip of the iceberg, really, because there's a lot of other functionality in Tabular Editor. So for example, we have batch rename. So if, for example, I select a number of measures here and I hit F2, oh, hang on, why doesn't this work? That's interesting. Okay, never mind. That was a bug here, something I have to look into on my end. But anyway, now what I want to show you is that if you multi-select a number of objects here, we now get this batch rename functionality. So instead of typing Norway. Maybe we wanted it to say Oslo instead, so we just click, and you can see right away it renames all of our measures. We can hit save, and we see the same thing happening over in desktop. So it's just, you know, it's just much easier to work with, and in my opinion, it's also a little more intuitive once you're just, you know, creating measures and applying format strings and that kind of stuff. But why stop there? Because those of you who have used Tabular Editor already may have noticed that Tabular Editor has this scripting functionality, and this can really take your productivity to the next level. So let's say now that I go and delete all of the measures I created. So typically what you want to do when you build a model such as this and you've imported a number of tables is that you normally always want to create explicit measures. So basically if you have a column in your model, extended amount or tax amount or discount amount and so on, what you actually want to do is you want to indicate to a Power BI desktop that Power BI desktop should not summarize these columns. Instead, they should maybe I should hide the columns, or I should set the summarization to don't summarize, and then I should create an explicit measure on top of this column instead. And there are two reasons for doing that. One of them is that, well, maybe there are more reasons, but one of the reasons why you always want to have explicit measures is that if you have any Excel users, that are going to open your model with Analyze in Excel, well, then they won't be able to browse the model in the pivot table, because they actually need explicit measures before the pivot table can work. Secondly, if you're going to use the new calculation groups feature, then having explicit measures is actually a requirement. So I created a script that you can also find on the GitHub site, which basically just takes whatever columns that you have currently selected here. So by holding down the control key, I can select multiple columns. And then when I execute this script, it's going to add a new measure to the same table as the column for every single one of these measures. And as the name of the measure, it's just going to split the camel case name of the column into individual words. And for the DAX expression, it's just going to take a simple use the sum function of DAX with the column name. And it's also going to reuse the display folder. And finally, it's going to hide the column. So a lot of things happening just when I execute the script all at once. But let me just show you how it works. So now I selected 4 columns here. And when I hit the little run button up here, sure enough, I get 4 new measures in my model. You can see the expression here for each of them. So just with a simple click of a button, I can generate my explicit measures. And now I know this was a very simple example because I only had 4 measures, but imagine you have a huge model with many numeric columns and you want to have them to create explicit measures for each of them. Well, then you can imagine that it takes a lot of time to create all of these measures by hand, but using a script such as this, it's just a couple of seconds. And why stop there? Because in most organizations, you want to have additional flavors of each of these measures. Typically, you want to have something like time intelligence. So for the discount amount, so for each measure, actually, you want to have maybe a month-to-date version and a year-to-date version and so on. And just to demonstrate this without going into too much details on this script, you can again find that on GitHub if you're interested. This is another script that will go through every single one of the measures that you have currently selected. And for each measure, it's going to create a year-to-date version, a previous year version, a year-over-year version, and so on and so forth. And it's going to put all of these measures into a display folder called Time Intelligence. Now, before this works, there's just one thing we need to set up. We need to specify here what the date column of our model is called. And on this particular model, the date column is called full date alternate key. So I'm going to put that name in here because otherwise the DAX expression will not provide the correct formula. So I'm going to modify the script slightly, and then I'm going to select the 4 measures that I created before. And then I'm going to run the script. And now we get this nice time intelligence folder here, and you can see once we expand it, it contains a bunch of measures. So just imagine how long time you would have spent in the past creating all of these measures inside Power BI Desktop one by one. Now, of course, it'll take you some time to get familiar with these scripts and how to use them, but once you've created them, you can reuse them across every single new Power BI model that you're going to create, and it's going to save you so much time. So I'll click the Save button here just to show you that this actually works. And going back to Power BI Desktop, you can see we now have this Time Intelligence folder, and sure enough, here we have all of our measures ready to use. We can bring them in here, and hopefully some of them will show some figures. Well, right now they're probably not showing a lot because I'm not slicing by time. So let's just add the calendar year and the month name, and then you can see we're starting to get some figures in here. So okay, so right now the calendar has not been properly sorted, but you get the picture. The point here is to show you that we can spit out a lot of these measures using script. And there's a lot of other functionality in Tabular Editor. So you've probably already seen how I'm using the property grid down here, where you have full control over all the metadata settings that you can apply to various objects. So on a measure, for example, you can set the description, display folder, whether or not it should be hidden. And that's a ton of options you can set in here. And this is all basically just properties from analysis services that have been exposed here so that you can play with them. So yeah, so a ton of stuff going on, and hopefully it will save you a lot of time in the future. Do we have any questions at this point, Ida, or should I proceed?
No, they're actually right now, real-time question. Is writing scripts in GitHub open to public to edit or add? Is there any sort of verifications?
Okay, good question. Everyone, so the way GitHub works is that I own the repository that holds all of the scripts. So if people want to add new scripts or edit existing scripts, what they will have to do is they will have to fork the repository into their own sort of name, and then once they made the changes or added the new scripts that they want, then they can submit a pull request to my repository, and then I can either approve or reject the pull requests. So let me just show you that on GitHub. I actually just a couple of days ago I created this new repository under Tabular Editor / scripts, and the idea here is that over time this will grow into a repository of scripts that people can use, hopefully mostly useful scripts. Right now I'm the only sort of moderator of this repository, so just you know, to cover my back, I put this big fat disclaimer in here that that scripts are provided as is without warranty, because as you know, you should probably never just execute arbitrary code on your machine without actually knowing what that code does, and that is your responsibility as the user of Tabular Editor, that you don't inadvertently take some script that would do bad things to your model or to your local computer. So I don't know if that's what the sort of the question hinted at, but yeah, if you want to explore scripting, you should at least look through the code. If you receive a script from someone you don't really trust, then make sure to just, you know, look it over, and feel free to open an issue here and ask a question if you have any doubts about what the script does. All right.
Thank you very much. I also posted the link in the chat. So
okay, cool. Yeah. So other stuff we can do in here. Well, the basic user interface lets us do a couple of stuff. For example, we can search for items here. So if I type something like sales, then I see all the objects that have sales in their name, like this. To make it easier to find stuff. We can also, if we don't care about the columns, then we can hide the columns up here, so we're only seeing tables that have. So right now they're also showing the partitions, but we can hide those as well. So now we're only showing tables that have measures, and then we can also decide whether or not we want to show the display folders. So if we toggle these off, we just see all the measures in one long list here, and you can sort of, you know, configure this the way you prefer to work with your model. Also note that one interesting thing here is that if I have another model, so let's say I have a model on analysis services, Tabular, and I have some nice DAX code or something in this model that I would like to bring over to my Power BI model, well, then nothing actually prevents me from picking up these measures from here, clicking copy, and then pasting them over here. So let's just do something like this. And here you go. Now all of these measures are suddenly available in my Power BI model. Now, one thing to be aware of is that the DAX code that was copied does not necessarily work on this model. And you would be able to see that if you hit the save button right now. You can see a lot of these measures get these yellow triangles. And that's because the model I copied these measures from contains tables that have different names. And so you can see, for example, this guy says, this expression cannot find table date, and that's because in the model I copied it from the calendar table was just called date, whereas in the Power BI model I copied it to it's called calendar. So of course you need to be aware of if there are any naming differences when you copy stuff like this. But this is just to show you that it is actually possible. Let me just undo this to get back to where we were before. So in the presentation earlier, I mentioned that there's this, in addition to being able to add measures to a model like this, there's this new feature in the analysis services engine called calculation groups that we can use thanks to Tabular Editor. And the way that works is you come in here and you right-click on the tables node, and then you choose Create New Calculation Group. And what it'll do is that it'll create something that looks like a table in here. You can notice the icon here is a little bit different to indicate that this is a calculation group. Now, from an end user perspective, the calculation group looks like any other table. It just looks like a table with one column, and that column is called name by default. Of course, you can rename it. In this case, let me create a calculation group called time intelligence, because that's one of the use cases of calculation groups is an easier way to create time intelligence. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to go back and then delete all of the measures that my script created a moment ago. So we're going to delete all of this, keeping only the 4 base measures that we created. And then here under the calculation group, we can create these calculation items. And each item is going to become one record of the table, basically. So by doing something like this, year to date, and let's add quarter to date as well. Then we're basically going to create one table that holds 4 rows corresponding to each of these 4 items. Now, each of these items has a DAX expression that we have to specify. And this DAX expression is one that will be applied to all of the measures in your model whenever the calculation item is in the filter context. So for example, for the calculation item called current, I'm just going to put a DAX expression here called selected measure. And what this function will do is it will just return the value of whatever measure we are currently looking at. So if we're looking at sales amount, it's just going to show you the sales amount. If we're looking at discount amount, it's going to show you discount amount, and so on. So that's not really interesting, but what I'm going to do for the year-to-date calculation item is I'm going to use this DAX function called total year-to-date instead, and I'm going to apply that function to the selected measure. And then the total year-to-date also needs a reference to the date column of the model. So just drag that in. And then the final DAX expression looks like this, because this means that now when we selected the year-to-date calculation item, we're going to apply this DAX logic to any measure that we selected. So this is a much more elegant way of reusing the same DAX logic across all of the measures in your model. Let me just, to complete this, let's just make sure we fill out the remaining 2 items, the total month to date and the total quarter to date. And then I also need to set up my calendar as a date table. We could do that from inside Power BI Desktop as well, but I just need to do it in one way or another to make sure that the DAX functions, time intelligence functions, behave as we expect. And then we hit save. Yes. And probably this visual here is, oh, okay. So this is, so the build of Power BI Desktop that I'm using just through this nasty looking error here, and this is because this is a preview build that I'm using through. So of course there's still some issues. I'm just going to ignore this for now. Hopefully things will still work. And let's get rid of this guy. And now we should see that, sure enough, we have this new time intelligence table here in our model. And as you can see, this just contains a single visible column, name. And if we drag in the name, you can see that this holds the calculation items that we created in Tabular Editor. Now here comes the magic part, because if we now do something like, okay, let's bring in, okay, first of all, let's create a slicer here by calendar year, an English month name, and I guess let's take one of the measures here. Let's take the sales amount measure, and let me see if I can enlarge this a little bit so it's easier to see what's going on. And here we see that I forgot to sort my my English month name by month number, so let me just fix that right away. So go to calendar, click on English month name, and choose sort by month number of year. And there we go, it looks a little bit better now. Now, the interesting thing here happens when I bring in the time intelligence name column as the columns here, because now you can see that the DAX calculation that I created in the calculation items applies, and you can see how the year-to-date nicely accumulates throughout the year, how quarter-to-date also accumulates within each quarter, and so on. And keep in mind that we didn't explicitly specify which measure this should apply to. So that means if we remove sales amount from this visual and we take one of the other measures, so discount amount, for example, we can see that we now get the same behavior on an entirely different measure. So in short, calculation groups allows us to reuse DAX logic across all of the measures in our model. And thanks to Tabular Editor, we can now unlock this functionality inside of Power BI Desktop. So,
Daniel, can I maybe take a question in this
absolutely.
natural?
Yeah.
So, there is one here. I have a Power BI file with some measures created, connected with a live connection to my model in SSAS. Yeah. I want to pass the measures from the PBIX to the model in SSAS. Is there any way to connect to the template of that Power BI with live connection to the Tabular Editor to copy the measures and paste them into the model in SSAS?
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, I'm afraid the answer is no. When you have a Power BI file with a live connection to AS, then Tabular Editor cannot in any way open the file. It cannot connect or anything like that. And the reason for that is that every time you have a live connection, then you don't have the underlying analysis services engine running. It's basically just, Power BI Desktop is just sending DAX queries to the live source that you are connected to. Even if you export it as a Power BI template, it's stored in a weird format where it doesn't contain any tabular model metadata. And for that reason, it's not possible for at least for Tabular Editor to go into the file and figure out which measures are there. Unfortunately, if you're curious, you could probably take the PBIT file, rename it to something like a zip, and then unzip it and try to take a look at the files that are in there and see if you can somehow identify anything that resembles measure definitions. But unfortunately, that's the best we can do at this point, since Power BI files that use Live Connect do not hold the tabular object model metadata at all. So they are not compatible with Tabular Editor. If you saw the MBAS presentation last week, where they revealed the big new feature called composite models, then we will probably be able to do something once that arrives, because with a composite model, you actually, even though you have one or more live connections in the composite model, you actually also have a tabular model running as your composite model, basically. And once you have a tabular model in your PBIX file, well, then you can use Tabular Editor like I'm showing you here. But for now, I'm afraid there's no luck.
Should I take another question or wait a little bit?
Go ahead. If there are more questions, keep them coming.
Yeah, there are plenty. Is it possible to use scripting to create a time intelligence table, or is the scripting limited to creating measures only?
Okay, great question. So scripting is not limited in itself. So basically anything that you can do through Tabular Editor's user interface can also be done through scripting. And I believe I actually have, yeah, okay, so this is not a time intelligence table, but this is a similar pattern that I'm using to create a calculated table for using with switching between different KPIs. And it's more or less the same technique you could use for time intelligence. Now, the main issue is that if you're working on a Power BI model, then we don't have any support for adding calculated tables to the model. So even though the scripting engine in Tabular Editor supports adding new tables to the model, well, then Power BI Desktop is not going to support adding tables through Tabular Editor. And so for the same reason, when you are connected to your Power BI file using Tabular Editor, for the same reason, Tabular Editor will not allow you to add tables or calculated tables, only calculation groups, as you can see here, because there's no support for this, for tables or calculated tables. Now, one thing I just glossed over quickly is that under File and Preferences, we have this unsupported Power BI features thing. And if you decide to put a check mark in here, well, then Tabular Editor removes all of the restrictions that are there. So now you can see at least we can create calculated tables. Tables are still grayed out, but that's because there are no data sources. And now, of course, we can also add those. But just keep in mind that if you do this with the unsupported Power BI features, well, then you are going to basically unlock all of the analysis services engine features. And these are not all supported by Power BI Desktop. So at this point, you're once again, you're on your own. So at the very least, make sure to keep a backup of your PBIX file before you start to experiment with this. If you disable this checkbox, then Tabular Editor only allows you to do stuff that is expected to be fully supported by Power BI Desktop once this new external tools ribbon is released. Yeah, so scripting can do it. So if you're working on an analysis service tabular model, then there's no issue. You can just go wild and script basically anything in the model, create tables, rename stuff, move stuff around. It's completely up to you. But on a Power BI model, there is some limitations. Oh, I should mention that these limitations only apply to the model that is currently loaded in desktop. So if you have a model that you published to the Power BI service and you're on a Power BI premium or dedicated capacity, so that you have the XML read-write endpoint, well, then these limitations no longer apply. So in other words, and that's actually the next part of my demo, so just go ahead a little bit. So here you can see that I'm on a Power BI workspace, and you can see from the little diamond icon up here at the top that this is on dedicated capacity. That means that I have the XML read-write endpoint available. And once the XML read-write endpoint is available, we can actually connect to the dataset here from Tabular Editor. And then there are no limitations. Then you can basically do anything like add new tables and so on. Let's take a couple more questions before I move into that part, Ida, if there are more.
I think you can actually move on. That's it for now.
Okay,
great.
Good. Okay, so yeah, so speaking of the Power BI Premium endpoint, so in order to enable the XML read-write, so first of all, let me show you that you don't necessarily need to have Power BI Premium in order to use the XML read-write endpoint. What you could do instead is that you can go into the Azure portal and then you can create what's called a Power BI embedded resource. Now, even though the title says Power BI Embedded, this is not only for creating Power BI embedded applications. The great thing about spinning up this guy here, this is also something that's called an A SKU, is that it's much cheaper. You can see here by the price in Danish kroner, it's a lot cheaper than running the full Power BI premium subscription. So if you start with the lowest tier here, where you can have up to a 3 GB data model loaded, then you save a lot of money compared to what a full Power BI premium subscription costs. But you get all of the premium functionality once you have the A1 SKU. So in other words, going over here to Power BI, going into a workspace and clicking on the premium tab, you can see that I already set this up to be on dedicated capacity, where I just in the dropdown I just chose the Power BI embedded resource that I created through the Azure portal, and then I actually get the full Power BI premium functionality for a fraction of the price, basically. Furthermore, you only pay for the time where you're using this. So if your company only needs access to the workspace during working hours, well, then you can create a schedule that will automatically pause the Power BI embedded resource when you're not using it, and then you could save even more on the costs. And then one other thing you need to specify in here in the portal in order to use the XML read-write endpoint, going over to the Power BI embedded side here and going into the capacity, you'll see that here under management and workloads, I believe, yeah, under workloads you can see I have the read-write enabled. By default, I believe it's set to off or maybe read-only. You need to set that to read-write, because this is what allows us to connect to the endpoint using Tabular Editor, and also to make changes to the data sets that are already published there. We can even publish new data sets from within Tabular Editor if that's what we wanted. So going back to the workspace, you can see right now I have a single data set in here, the AdventureWorks full. And just to show you that I can connect to this workspace, let me just open up a new instance of Tabular Editor. And I will go here and say open from database. And I think I have it on my recent lists. Yeah, it's right here. You can see the URL here. So the URL for the premium endpoint would look something like this, where this is the name of your organization, and then this part here would be the name of the workspace itself. And if you have doubts, you can go back to the Power BI service, click on workspace settings, and then under premium you can see you get the URL here. Now unfortunately it seems that there's a bug here because it doesn't show the correct organization name, but as long as you know what your organization is called, then you should be able to figure this out. So you go into Tabular Editor, you put the string in here as the server name, you click OK, and then of course you have to log in, and you need to have admin rights on the workspace to be able to use Tabular Editor like this. And here we can see the name of the data set that is already there. So we just open this data set, and sure enough we get the model, and now we can go ahead and make changes. And notice here that now Tabular Editor is no longer limiting the things we can do like it did when we were connected to a Power BI desktop data set. And that's because if you're using the XML read-write endpoint, well, then you're basically just using, it's very similar to using Azure Analysis Services. And that means that you have basically unlocked all of the Analysis Services engine features and can do anything that's possible with a tabular model, and Tabular Editor lets you do that. So if you had a script that would add a new table to the model, well, then you could execute that script now, hit the save button, and it would just work. Also, if you want to make a deployment from inside Tabular Editor, that's also possible. So with this version of Tabular Editor, there's a bug, but basically it works. So let me just show you how deployment works. So let's say I want to deploy a copy of this data set. So just go to Model and hit Deploy. I make sure that the name here, the URL, is the URL of the dedicated capacity workspace that I want to deploy to. I hit next, and then I need to provide a name on the new dataset. So let's call this UG Norway, something like this. We hit next a couple of times and then deploy. And now I expect that this will show an error message, but that's the bug I was talking about a second ago. So even though we are getting this error message here, it turns out that when we go over to the service and we go back to our data sets, you can see now we have the UG Norway data set here. Now, of course, it doesn't contain any data because I haven't refreshed it yet, but I should be able to refresh it just fine, and then I can start to create reports on top of that. So the main point here is that if you have access to an XMLA read-write endpoint, well, then you unlock the full potential of Tabular Editor. And basically, you could decide to just, close Power BI Desktop altogether and just do all of your modeling work inside Tabular Editor. Of course, one thing you have to be aware about when you're using the XMLA read-write endpoint is that if you add any objects to your model that require any kind of recalculation or refresh operations to be performed, then you have to perform these operations manually. So let me illustrate what I'm talking about here. I'm using Management Studio to connect to the same workspace. And you can see now we have these two databases. Now the UG Norway one does not contain any data, and if I try to run a DAX query on this guy, of course I could use DAX Studio as well if I prefer. So if I try to write something like evaluate customer, it's going to just return empty, showing me that there's no data in it just yet. Another example I could give you here, so if I connect to the AdventureWorks database, so let me just change the connection here, and then run the same DAX query, then you can see that we do actually have some data in there. But the problem is, let's say, for example, I go into Tabular Editor and I add a new calculated column to the customer table. And let's just call this column something like dummy, and let's put a DAX expression as 1, 2, 3, nothing fancy, and we hit save. Now the problem is that if I try to evaluate the same DAX expression once again, I'm going to get an error because the column dummy does not hold any data because it needs to be recalculated. So before we can query the table now, we need to make sure that it's recalculated. So for calculated tables and calculated columns, we actually need to process the database. And the process we need to apply is a process recalc. So you can either do it this way, clicking OK here, or you can script this operation if that's what you wanted. And it'll look like this, and should only take a couple of seconds to complete. There we go. And then we can go back and evaluate the customer table, and now we see the data and we see our dummy column here. So for some reason it doesn't contain anything. Not really sure why that is. I think it's just a bug in Management Studio. Oh, that's right, because I put the 1, 2, 3 under the advanced script and not the DAX expression for this column. So let me try to put it there instead. And let's try to refresh it once again. And then going back here, evaluating the table, we can now see that it now contains the values as expected. So there's a little more work here to manually refresh the model data, which Power BI Desktop normally does for you under behind the scenes. And that's actually one of the reasons why we see the little working on it spinner all the time inside Power BI Desktop, because every time you change a DAX expression or add a new calculated column or stuff like that, it's going to go and do this refresh behind the scenes, and that's what you have to wait for. In my opinion, as a professional, I like the approach of controlling these operations manually. So being able to apply a lot of different changes in one go without having to wait for each of them. And then once I'm ready, I can go in using Management Studio, and I can go and do the refresh operation. And then I can go and test what I have. So I could either, just write a DAX query here, or since this is a Power BI dataset, I can just create a new report and connect it with a live connection to the Power BI dataset. and just to show you that this actually works, let's go in here and say get data. And then we choose from the Power Platform our Power BI datasets. And here you can see it should display that we already have these two, AdventureWorks and the empty one we created. In this case, it's AdventureWorks. And now you can see we're in a live connection to the Power BI dataset. And on our customer table, we have our dummy column, which happen to contain the number 1, 2, 3 as we defined. So it works all the way through, and it's just, you know, it's just like working with analysis services when you're connected through the XML read-write endpoint. Okay, any questions at this stage?
Real-time one again. If you need to add another table to the model, how would you do that if you cannot download the PBIX and add the table using Power Query in Power BI Desktop?
Okay, so assuming that that you already made some edits to the model on the XML endpoint, it's absolutely correct that then you can no longer download the model as a PBIX file. So at that point, you would have to either publish once again, create a PBIX file again, or use the backup that you had from before, import some additional tables to that. Then of course, if you publish, you're going to override the model that you already have in your endpoint, or on which you may have made additional changes. At that point, you should look into the BISM normalizer tool, because this allows you to synchronize the changes from your PBIX file into the service in a way that you can select that, hey, I want to add this and this new table, and then at the same time I want to keep whatever other changes that you made in the service. That's one option. The other option is to simply add the new tables using Tabular Editor, because if you're working with the endpoint, well, then adding a new table would be a matter of copying an existing table, for example, the customer table. You can make a copy of this, and then of course you just modify the partition query, the M query on the partition, and then you'd have to sort of map the columns, make sure that it contains the columns that it needs to. Now this part, I admit, is a little bit, is kind of a heavy process if you have to go through all the columns one by one and make sure they map. There is another way where you can use this tool called import tables, and then I suggest, so if you're working with a Power BI model, then most of your partitions or all of your partitions would be using Power Query. And unfortunately, Tabular Editor cannot automatically infer the table schema from the Power Query expression. So for this reason, I provide this option down here where it says manually import metadata from another application. So if you choose this option and you click next, well, then all you have to do is paste some text here that specifies the columns and the data types of the table that you're going to import. So there are different ways you can do that. For example, if you have a Power BI file open, or even an Excel file, where just anywhere where you have a Power Query. So let me just, for sake of example, let me illustrate this using Excel. Let's say that you have a query in here in Excel that reads some data from a SQL Server database. So it's a Power Query basically. And it's just my local SQL database. And on this database, I have AdventureWorks, and let's just say we want to bring in the DIM organization table. And we click transform. And then basically what we can do is, so this table here is basically is showing us the contents of the table. So in other words, we have maybe 5 or 6 columns that we want to map into our tabular model. So what we would do in this case is we would use, so I think I have an article online somewhere that describes this, but this is the M expression that we would use as the partition expression in our tabular model. So we will copy this one. And then if you take a look at Tabular Editor, I believe, yeah, there's even a link here that that provides information on how you can use Power Query to get this information. And basically, there's an M function here called table.schema, which gives us what we want. So what I do is if I go back to Power Query and I add a new step here, let's just call it schema, and then I use the table.schema function on the previous step, and then this is the one that we want to output, and we click OK. Then we get a table that looks like this, which has all the column names and their data types. And now the magic thing happens is if we just copy this table over to Tabular Editor and we paste it in here, well, then Tabular Editor automatically figures out which columns you have in your source and what the data types are. And then you just click import and you give the table a name. Now it's just called new table, as you can see. And then all the columns are already mapped for you to the corresponding source column. So the only thing you need to do is to enter the M expression into the partition itself, so that once you try to refresh the table on the Power BI service, that it knows which M expression to execute in order to load this table with data. So that's one option. Another option is to use a different kind of data source called legacy data sources instead of using the Power Query data sources, because if you're using a legacy data source, then you can specify just, if you're working with a SQL Server data source, for example, then you can just specify a connection string, provide the credentials or whatever, and then Tabular Editor makes it a lot easier to import the tables that you need. You can simply just click the tables from in here, hit import, and Tabular Editor imports the tables, maps all the columns, and even provides a select T-SQL select statement for the partition query for each of them. So these are the two ways basically that you can add new tables once you have a model published to the Power BI service. All right. Any other questions at this point, Ida?
Yeah, there is actually two, but then I also sent them the link to Just's blog on using XMLA endpoint without premium, because that's kind of a reoccurring question in here. But if you have anything to add on that, please do.
No, I mean that's actually the best source of information at the moment is his blog, where he explains in great details how to set up the resource, like I showed you here in the Azure portal and so on. That's the way you'd want to do it. And then he also explains how to perform deployments using Tabular Editor and all of that stuff. So it's a great resource, a great link to read up on if that's the direction that you want to go in. So one of the last things that I'm going to show you. So how much time do we have today, Ida?
We actually have until 7, unless you have other more important things to do.
Okay. Well, I guess okay. I thought it was to be around 6:30 or something, but
yeah,
okay,
of course.
Okay.
It depends on how much time you have or how much content you have, basically.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the next thing I want to highlight is another feature of Tabular Editor called the Best Practice Analyzer. And this is a feature that sort of lets you create better quality models by continuously scanning the model metadata in order to see if you adhere to all the various best practice rules of tabular modeling. So this could be stuff like naming conventions, for example, to never have columns that have the word key in their name, or maybe I don't know, that columns always need to start with a capital name, capital letter, or whatever. Or it could be other more modeling oriented things, like making sure that you always have dimension tables, conform dimension tables. Making sure that all of your numeric columns are either hidden or have the don't summarize properties set. Stuff like that that can basically improve the quality overall of your model. And if you click the little link down here in Tabular Editor, it brings up the best practice analyzer, where you can see all of the various rules that are defined. So you can see in this case, I have a rule that says do not use floating point data types. And that's just in general bad practice, because floating point data types can give you all sorts of weird round-off errors. when you're using them in calculations. So every time you're working with the monetary amounts, you should in general always use the fixed decimal data type to avoid any unforeseen issues with this. Of course, if for some reason you have some columns in your model where you must have the floating point decimal data type, well, then of course you can go in and ignore that particular item. It'll put an annotation on the column so that in the future, when the best practice analyzer scans it, it's going to just ignore this particular item. But in general, in this case, well, I don't have any reason for using floating point data types. And just so you understand what I'm talking about, if I click one of these guys here, you can see that the data type of the column is set to double. And this is the native sort of name for this data type. It corresponds to what's called decimal number in Power BI. And what we want to do is we want to change this to be the currency or fixed decimal number, this guy here. And you can see as soon as we change the data type of this column, it actually disappeared from the best practice analyzer. And now for simple things like changing a property on an object, the best practice analyzer can actually do that for us. You can see that we have this apply fix here. If we want to review the changes made, we can also have the best practice analyzer generate a fix script. So let me just try to do that. And you can see it copies the script to the clipboard. So if we insert it here in the advanced scripting window, you actually get the script that shows you what the best practice analyzer is going to do. Basically, it's going to alter the data type of all of these columns to be the data type .decimal, which is the fixed decimal data type. So I could either run the script, or I can simply apply the fix from in here. And right away, we fix this issue, and we can now save our model back to the Power BI service. And then we no longer have any columns that use the floating point data type in our model. There are also a lot of other interesting rules here. For example, there's a rule here that says avoid camel case on visible columns and hierarchies. And that's just to make the model a little more pretty. Instead of calling things like number employees in one word with a capital N and a capital E, this rule here suggests that we should change the naming of this guy so that it looks a little more pretty. So in this case, I'm not sure it can. No, in this case, it cannot apply the fix on its own, but it should be relatively easy to go in here and just rename this column, add a space between number and employees, and then sure enough, it disappears from here. Before we had 150 objects, now we only have 149 objects to go and fix this way, and so on and so forth with all of these rules. Now, when you download Tabular Editor, you will see that you won't have any rules available on your machine. So the best practice analyzer will just remain empty. So either you should go in and start to create your own rules. You provide a name for them, an ID, and there's some other options here you can provide. You specify what kind of object the rule should apply to. So whether this is a rule that should scan all the columns or measures and so on your model. And finally, you have to specify an expression here. So we can, so let's just create a simple rule here that's called avoid key in names. So basically what we want to do is we want to go through all of the measures of our model. Our measures is a bad example. Let's go through all of the columns of our model, and that applies to both calculated columns, calculated table columns, and data columns. And if we have any of these columns where the name ends with key, then we want to capture that. And immediately you can see it identifies 57 objects here where all of the names end with key. And of course, we could make this even more advanced if we wanted to. So for example, we could write that this rule should only apply if the object is visible. So there's syntax for that as well. So if we go and add that, we can see that now the list shrinks to just 32 objects which are visible and have the name, the word key in their name. We should probably go and do something about that. And so in this way, we have a lot of flexibility in how we define the rules and what we want the best practice analyzer to scan for. And you can find some articles online on the GitHub site that shows you how to write these expressions to identify certain objects. But to get you started, I recommend another link here that I'm sure that Ida will also put in the chat or somewhere that you guys can find it afterwards. There's another GitHub repository called Best Practice Rules, where similar to the repository for scripts, I have this repository where I try to combine all of the rules provided by the community, or at least rules that I sort of feel apply in a more broad sort of manner. So this is probably not the right place for company-specific naming conventions or anything like that, but for rules that you should always sort of follow whenever you're building a tabular models. Those are the kind of rules that I'm going to add to this repository. I also encourage you, if you want to enforce a specific kind of rule in your own organization, please go ahead and ask the question on the issue tracker. If you don't know how to write the expression for the rule, feel free to describe in plain words what it is that you want the rule to do, and then I'd be happy to provide the expression that you need to use in order to implement that rule. But if you come in here and you want to get some rules right off the bat to get started, then I suggest using the standard set of rules that we have here. You can see it's just a JSON document that looks like this. If you click on the raw button, you get a link here to the raw JSON file on GitHub. And this URL is actually one that you can go back over to Tabular Editor. And then you can actually import this rule file from a URL. So if you don't have any rules to start with, then let me just, to illustrate that, let me just delete everything that I have on my machine already. So right now I deleted all the rules, so now there are no rules at all on my machine. But now I want to add rules from this URL, and we can just add them just like this, and we hit OK. And then you can see we have all of these rules that were defined in the JSON file on GitHub. At the moment we click OK, we can see that now we scan our Power BI model according to these best practices. So this is a good way to make start and make sure you understand what these rules do and why it's important to adhere to the principles provided here. Because just overall to make sure that your model is at a certain quality and does not have some of the common anti-patterns and stuff that you generally want to avoid. So what else? Tabular Editor has many features, and I haven't covered a fraction of them just yet. Another interesting feature that you might want to like, let me just open another model where it's a little easier to highlight. So this is just once again, an AdventureWorks model that I have on my local machine. If you want to examine the dependency between your DAX measures, so we already know that we can edit the DAX expression of our measures inside Tabular Editor, and it's very easy to go and look at the measures. We can also format the DAX expression by clicking this button up here. It will send the DAX expression to the DAX formatter website. And once I click, you can see we get the formatted version back. So you can see now it added a couple of spaces here. Let me see if I can find a better example. Let's take something like this one and hit format, and you can see now it gets nicely formatted. So there's an easy way to format the measure. You can even easily create a script that automatically formats all the measures of your model. That would just look like something like for each measure in my model, it would be something like this. For each M in model all measures, M expression equals format DAX, something like this. So basically this is a C# expression which loops through all the measures of my model, and then for each measure M, it's going to set the expression to the original expression, but calling the format DAX function on it, so that all the expressions of the model will have been formatted. So running this will take a couple of seconds to complete, because now it's going to send every measure to the DAX formatter web service. So it's going to hit it a couple of 100 times, depending on how many measures I have in my model. But once it's completing, There you go. Now you can see we get this little blue question mark on every one of these measures, and this indicates that a change was made to the DAX expression of this measure. And sure enough, if we now browse through all of these, we can see that now they have been nicely formatted according to the DAX formatter rules. So once we click Save, back to our tabular model, we now have nicely formatted DAX expressions everywhere. Furthermore, if we want to see how the dependencies of our measures are, so let's say, for example, that, okay, so now we're looking at this particular measure, and we want to know if this measure is being referenced by any other measures. Well, if you right-click and you choose Show Dependencies, then this guy will show you the DAX dependencies of this measure. So in this case, there are no objects that depend on internet current quarter gross profit performance. However, if we click up here, we can see that this measure is depending on this measure and this measure, and we can drill down all the way to the base column from which this measure was defined. So this is the DAX dependencies between the objects that we can view this way. This is useful if we want, for example, to refactor some of the DAX code in our model, or if we want to delete some measures and we want to make sure that they're not being used in any other measures. Then this is an interesting feature to use. So you can see in this case, for example, internet total sales is being used both by total sales and total sales sliced by employee and so on and so forth. And each of these in turn have deeper dependencies. So this is all something that's interesting to look at when you're writing DAX code. There's also automatic formula fix-up happening. So for example, here where I have a measure called internet previous quarter sales, and you can see this measure is using the internet total sales measure. If I then rename internet total sales, so what I can do is I can put the cursor over here over the internet total sales measure, and then I can hit the little navigate button up here, or I can hit F12, and it'll just jump over to internet total sales. So this is a nice way to navigate through the DAX expressions. If you forgot what the definition of internet total sales was, you can just put the cursor here and then press F12, and you go over to the internet total sales measure, and then you can use the little arrows to go back. But then one thing to notice here is that if I rename this object, then it'll also make sure to rename all of the dependent measures, or rename the references in the dependent measures, just as you would expect. And I believe Power BI Desktop does the same thing, but it's just nice to know that you can safely rename objects here and things just work. So yeah, so naturally there's a ton of other features here, and I really encourage you to just go ahead and download the tool, try to play with it. Feel free to provide feedback on the GitHub side, and it doesn't necessarily have to be feature requests or bug reports, but any questions you have, if there's something you can't figure out how to do, just let me know. Feel free to, even though it's called an issue tracker on GitHub, and that should be on the Tabular Editor GitHub site, which is currently under my name, something like this, I believe. Yeah, so this is where you download Tabular Editor from the releases tab. You can see the latest release here, 2.98. And this is where we have the issue tracker. And here you can feel free to create new issues, even if it's not an issue, but just a question. If there's something you'd like to know, just put it here. Maybe I won't respond within a day or two, but someone else from the community might answer your questions that you have here. So feel free to go in and use this with anything related to Tabular Editor. So I think that's about what I want to show you today, and I suggest we spend another 5-10 minutes for any questions that you may have at this point.
I can see there are some in the chat window, so I can read those up for you.
I think I can, since I'm no longer actually.
Yeah, or maybe you could just see them.
Oh, here we go. Okay, so how do we read this? Okay, so let me start from. Okay,
I've taken all. It's actually one private one, so this I have to read, I think.
Oh, okay.
Unused measures be added to the best practice rules?
Could you repeat that, please?
can showing unused measures, so the ones not used in the
That's a good question. So if by unused measures you mean measures that are not being used by any individuals, then I'm afraid the answer is no, because the tabular object model, which is the model metadata that Tabular Editor has access to, does not contain any information about the visuals in your Power BI reports. So unfortunately for identifying if there are any measures in the model that are not being used in any visuals, then Tabular Editor cannot help you. But I believe there's another tool available from, I think it's Imke Feldman, who made a tool called, what's it called, Power BI Helper or something, I don't recall, but I think there's a tool that actually goes in and inspects the visuals as well in order to identify if there are any measures in your model that are not being used anywhere, or maybe it's the other way around where it identifies which measures are actually being used. So I think there's something that can be done in that area, but it's not part of Tabular Editor, unfortunately, since this information about the report visuals is nowhere to be found in the tabular object model. If, however, you want to detect if you have hidden measures that are not being used in other calculations. So for example, if you had made a lot of calculations and intermediate calculations, and then at some point you find a different way of doing things and you want to make sure that you clean up your model by removing all of the hidden intermediate calculations that you're no longer using, then the answer is yes. Then you can create a rule, and I believe the standard set of rules already has this one particular rule. Let me see if I still have the URL here. Yeah, so I believe we already have a rule here somewhere called, remove unused measures. And what this rule does is it considers any hidden measures in your model that don't have any downstream dependencies. Because normally if a measure is hidden, then it means that your end user shouldn't be able to use that measure in their report. And then if at the same time you don't have any downstream dependencies, well, then you might as well get rid of that measure. Now for measures, it might not be that big of a deal because measures do not impact performance. Measures do not take up any space in memory when the model is refreshed. So for measures, it might not be that big a deal, except for keeping a tidy and clean model. But this other rule might be more interesting, where this identifies columns in your model that are hidden and are not being referenced by any measures, because those should definitely be removed from your model, because if you just have columns that take up that contain a lot of data, they're taking up a lot of memory, and if they're hidden and you're not using them in any calculation, well, then you might as well get rid of them. Okay, I guess that answered the question. So another question I see here in the chat, is there a plan to add DAX intelligence features to Tabular Editor? Unfortunately, not at this time. I am working on something in my spare time, but this is something that turns out to be a little more complex than I initially thought, and I want to do things right. But it is something I'm working on longer term, but it's not something I can provide a timeline on at this point. Another question I see here, can we use the Tabular Editor to process the tabular model on Power BI Desktop to see the partitions especially created by the incremental refresh? No and yes. So no to the first question. You cannot use Tabular Editor to process the model or to refresh the model. Earlier in my demo, I switched over to Management Studio in order to do the processing, and this would also be where you can find all of the partitions, and you can even refresh the partitions individually. Now, the reason that Tabular Editor does not let you refresh the model is that refreshing is an operation that can potentially take a long time to complete while the data is being loaded into a model. And you have to maintain a connection to analysis services or to the Power BI service endpoint while the refresh is in progress. So potentially it could take several hours to complete, and it would just freeze up the Tabular Editor UI while the refresh was running. So for that reason, I decided not to have refresh functionality. However, what you can do is if you have multiple partitions, so in this case this is a tabular model, but even if it had been a Power BI model with incremental refresh, you would be able to see all the various partitions generated by the incremental refresh policies, and then you'd be able to generate a script on top of these models, for example, to either merge them if you want to do that. Now for incremental refresh, you probably don't want to do that because that is handled automatically by the incremental refresh policy. But you could schedule, you could script refresh of either individual partitions or multiple partitions like I did here. So you can script refresh choosing the type of refresh operation you want to perform, and then, for example, script into clipboard. Then you can come back over to Management Studio and you can paste that in, and you see here the final script to refresh these 3 partitions. Okay, so I don't know if there are any other questions, or if we may already have answered those. I think I only see questions that are a little older than this. So unless more questions are coming in here in real time, or if anybody feels
I don't see any questions, but
okay. So yeah, but again, if you have any questions later on, feel free to write them on GitHub. Feel free to download the tool, play with it. Again, make sure to keep a backup of your PBIX file, because as I said initially, making changes directly to the instance of Power BI Desktop is not supported yet, but it will be supported very soon, hopefully. And yeah, I guess that's it. I hope you enjoyed this, and yeah.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I can see there was actually a lot of shout outs to you for your contributions, and that you do magic and all kind of nice words. So which I think we all agree on. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and I've recorded this and I will share that with everyone after as well. And awesome. To also highlight the Danish user group today, since there is a Power BI quiz at 8 o'clock, I pasted in the YouTube link where Adam Saxton will be a guest, I guess.
Yeah, I think Boost is hosting that. Yeah. Also, one last thing that I'd also like to mention, if you like to learn more, I actually did a series of videos for Power BI tips a couple of weeks ago. So there are 4 videos you can find on YouTube. I can probably find the link right away. So if you just go to YouTube and search for Power BI tips, Tabular Editor, something like that, yeah, you can see we have these 4 videos online. Where I'm basically, so the first one here, the introduction, is more or less the same as what I covered today, but then you can watch these other videos to learn more about scripting, about the best practice analyzer, and around using DevOps. So yeah, I think, yeah, and please add those tutorial links to the GitHub. I think that's already been done by Mike Carlo, who owns Power BI Tips. I believe if you go to the wiki, where you can find a lot of, or where you can find some documentation, I believe, yeah, the links to the webinars have already been added in here. So, so that's that. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for coming, and all of the participants for joining us today. And enjoy the rest of your